Welcome to Stone Club Walks and Talks, Episode 3. I'm your host, Matthew Shaw, Stone Club co-founder. Today we are joined by guest Annebella Pollen. Annebella is a professor of visual and material culture. Her research areas include mass photography and the popular image, and histories of art, craft, design and dress, especially marginal, alternative and non-canonical forms. But the reason why we're speaking with Annebella today is because of her book, The Kindred of the Kibbo Kift, Intellectual Barbarians. Annebella's book, The Kindred of the Kibbo Kift, is the first full-length work to explore the innovative cultural production of the English camping and hiking organisation, which existed from 1920 to 1932. It was founded after the First World War as a reaction to the militarism in scouting. Kibbo Kift developed into an all-ages organisation for men and women. It attracted the support of a range of high-profile writers, artists, scientists and campaigners, from D.H. Lawrence to H.G. Wells. It was underpinned by a complex, distinctive philosophy. Kibbo Kift's practices were wide-ranging, extending across health and handicraft, pacifism and propaganda, myth and magic, education and economics. They're a fascinating group, and we really do want to focus in on their connection with the ancient landscape in today's conversation. We also talk at length about John Hargrave, who was the founder of the Kibbo Kift. It's impossible really to talk about Kibbo Kift without talking about John, so there'll be plenty about him coming up. John Gordon Hargrave was born in 1894 and died in 1982. His Woodcraft name was White Fox. He was a prominent youth leader in Britain in the 20s and 30s. He was described in his obituary as an author, cartoonist, inventor, artist and psychic healer. He was a utopian thinker and he believed in both science and magic. He went on to work for the social credit movement in British politics. But today, let's talk about John in relation to Kibbo Kift. Welcome, Annebella. It's great to have you join us this morning, particularly so because I've just finished reading for the second time your Kindred of the Kibbo Kift book, and I can't get enough of it at the moment. The essays and chapters, really fascinating, and the imagery, photography, and all of those incredible costumes, just wow. But the thing that really struck me this time on second reading was the output. I think I was thinking a lot of Kibbo Kift as a perhaps a failed movement that didn't achieve its aims. But when thinking about Kibbo Kift as a creative force and our own personal creativity and the art and the output and all of that, wow, what a success. Because, it's just an incredible force for good for a while, wasn't it? It just really struck me that your point about that was incredibly positive.
Yeah, I just think that the artistic creativity of the group and the aesthetic, the way that they brought together the ancient and the futuristic, was something that was really fresh and original. And it can be fitted into, other artistic movements of the time, of course, of the 20s. But it was just so, the combination of the ancient landscape and the futuristic, the kind of caveman and the robots, the sort of English and then the global, all in combination. I found it really fascinating as a kind of hybrid visual style, and it seemed to really embody all of their interests. That was its purpose. They weren't just making this stuff for its own sake. It was all meant to be a manifestation of their beliefs. It was meant to be a kind of materialization of the covenant that was Kibbo Kift and the movement that was Kibbo Kift. So when I first came across them, it was the visuals, especially the costume and textiles, that I found really extraordinary, and that was the kind of hook for me to to research them, because there had been a book about Kibbo Kift before. There'd been a really interesting book, actually, written by Mark Drakeford, who is now the first minister in the Welsh Assembly. You know, he's basically the Prime Minister of Wales. He did his PhD on Kibbo Kift. Well, actually, he did it on their later manifestation. They reorganised as the Green Shirts in the 1930s, and he wrote this book about them as a social movement. And when I first came across these strange words for the first time, I went looking for anything written about them. I found that book, and I was just astonished that it didn't have a single photograph in it, a single visual image in it, because I could see at that point online, you could find the Kibbo Kift Foundation's own website, and that had a few sort of thumbnail size images of people in the English landscape in the 20s who seemed to be half Boy Scout, half Bauhaus, ballet, avant-garde artists. I thought, what on earth is going on? And I couldn't believe that you could write a book about this organisation without including any imagery. And yeah, I got set to work looking at their costume, looking at their surviving garments. I went to museum collections. I found surviving family members who had personal collections, and I started to look at, you know, what we could read from those garments and those textiles and those, especially the photographs. As you say, the photographs are really extraordinary, and I used the photographs in a very particular way in the book, with the help, I should say, of a very talented book designer, Roland Brockley. We used the images, for example, of Kibbo Kift walking the English landscape. We used them as a kind of way into the book. The first 8 pages or so, you walk with them through these ancient sites and you kind of follow in their footsteps. And yeah, the images, the photographic images are really extraordinary. They're very highly choreographed, very carefully taken, very beautifully done. And yeah, they really tell the story of this kind of mysterious movement.
I found them really stunning. The sort of, there's a bit of Robin Hood there too. There's a sort of cowl, so it is partly druidic, you know, or at least the classical image of the druid. But then you've got all of these, and the more you look at it, more and more intricate designs. I was looking at some of the Kinlog and some of the images in there, and you've got these, you know, small vignettes of people camping, and then you've got people climbing mountains, and you've got the symbol of I think it's the blue K, and then there's the fire and the smoke rising from it, and the tree and the 3 branches, and everything's packed with symbols. Everything is sort of a sigil. And again, that's something I really love you exploring, the magical use of symbols, probably based on the work of Austin Osman Spare. I thought that was very interesting as a contemporary. And also the parallels you drew between what was happening with woodcraft movement and later forest schools, and what was going on in the New Forest at Sandy Balls, and you know, the combinations there with Ross Nichols and Gerald Gardner and Crowley, of course. But I thought that was really interesting, the way you drew all that together, because we do know that there were exchanges there with Ross Nichols particularly, and John. And it seems more unlikely to me that they'd never have discussed these ideas than it would seem as absurd in a way that it never came up in conversation. It's like, oh, by the way, you know, I'm really interested in this sort of back to the land and magical use of symbols and language. And it seems there's still an uncovered story there. You reveal it to a degree and make some suggestions in the book, but it struck me that there was really something quite interesting and possibly magical going on with that group of people at that time.
Yeah, there definitely was. I mean, the sort of circles in which Hargrave moved, they included, you know, people who were interested in pagan mysteries, people who were interested in new practices in occultism. He worked for his wage for an advertising agency. So he mixed with artists who'd been trained at art school. He didn't have an art school education himself, but his father was a professional artist, and he'd had a lot of art school training kind of at his father's knee. And then he was involved in these outdoor youth movements and in alternative education as well. So part of what he and his wife were trying to do in their various kind of youth group leadership before Kibbo Kift was kind of instill the sort of outdoor living, tracking and trailing side of the Boy Scouts, the kind of woods side, campfire ceremony side of the Scouts and the Guides, into something that was more mystical. And Kibbo Kift brought all that together. They brought together the kind of occult ritual and ceremony. They brought together interests in ancient religion and ancient historical mystical ideas about the landscape with new avant-garde art practices, and a bit of Boy Scouts in for good measure. So you see all of those things kind of at once in the visual material that they communicated with. And I think members, might have been more interested in one or more of those strands, but somehow they're all sort of woven together in the garments they produced, in the regalia that they carried, in the kind of records that they created. And that you mentioned the kinlog, their sort of official history, where they were writing down as they saw it for historians of the future who would want to know how the new world was founded after the collapse of civilization. They'd want to know about this Kibbo Kift movement that was leading the new world out of the ashes of the old. It was there as a kind of Book of Kells style document, written in beautiful calligraphic script and really mythologizing the movement in a rather sort of sanitized history, actually, I should say, always very retrospective, always making all the kind of daily realities of being part of a small scale social movement sound more epic and more successful than perhaps they were. But yeah, it was using kind of Celtic styling there, using Celtic knotwork. Elsewhere, they were using, as you say, the sort of sigil method to kind of encapsulate and, make material their beliefs and their messages. So they used the kind of abstraction of the artistic avant-garde to kind of have, sort of subliminal messages communicated through the logos almost that they wore on their surcoats and the kind of staffs that they carried, which had very, very cryptic symbolism and messages on them. It was, it's hard to understand sometimes. I spent a long time looking at those objects and trying to read them symbolically, because often they have multiple layers of meaning. But they were intended to kind of encapsulate and bring into practice the things that they wanted to happen. I suppose that kind of contemporary phrase that we might use, be the change you want to see. They were trying to be the kinds of spiritual leaders of the new world, and they were trying to kind of correct all the things that they felt were lacking in contemporary culture. So they were very utopian, very idealistic, completely impractical, but also, incredibly inspiring in some ways as well, that they were sort of living the dream.
Yeah, I thought when I was looking through some of the images again, how modern they looked, and how I could see parallels there with things that didn't happen until much later, even sort of, 1976 onwards with Jamie Reed's work and how he was looking at monarchy and society and subverting that. And then later again, I suppose things like Throbbing Gristle and Coil and some of the more industrial and avant-garde music that was again really using these symbols, again referencing Austin Osman Spare, again looking at the power of what happens if you invest everything in a sigil and then you forget it, or you destroy it, or you make it part of your practice, and so it sort of brings on a life of its own. There's a manifestation element. And also, just going back to something you said a minute ago about investigating some of these themes, it was really fascinating to read the section about how John Hargrave would have expected people to be able to understand and know comparative religion. So it's important to have read and understand the similarities and differences and histories of what all of these different worldwide spiritual faiths were, so that there was a sort of at least basic knowledge, if not more thorough from what he was actually demanding in terms of what was going on, married with a very practical
ability to be able to survive and to camp in a very frugal and, well, actually quite difficult way. It sounded like, luxury was to be avoided at all costs. And actually having things that were aesthetically beautiful was very important, that had all of the symbols and so on, but actually comfort and pillows and, being warm or any of the things that you might actually hope for. It certainly was a long way from glamping, let's put it that way. It's
Yeah, absolutely. It was a massive commitment to be a member of Kibbo Kift. You had to sign up to a covenant that was enormously ambitious. You had to sign up to a commitment to being able to deliver nothing less than world peace. And along the way, the reform of economics, the reform of education, a world language, a world council, you had to kind of throw everything you had at it. And these were people who were not intellectual elites, really. Most of the members are white-collar workers, working as teachers, working as civil servants, working in 9-to-5 jobs without massive disposable income, but they didn't let any of that kind of cramp their style or their ambition. So yeah, you had to master not only all of the kind of artistic expectations, so you had to kind of come up with an alter ego, so some kind of new name that you would call yourself, a Kibbo Kift name. You had to manifest that in a kind of a symbol that might be a symbol of an animal or a figure from mythology or even something of your own imagination. You had to craft that into a staff, a ceremonial costume with a logo on that represented your new name and identity, and a camp role as well, if you had a sort of role in the institution. You then had to have a camping outfit as well, which you had to make yourself. They didn't exist to buy in the shop, so you had to craft your own outfit. You had to build your own tent, design and create your own tent. You had to decorate your own tent as well, with original symbolism always. It could mingle the futuristic and the ancient symbols that were recommended, but it always had to be original. So that was the kind of artistic demand on membership. But yeah, you had to commit to being fit enough and strong enough, spiritually, mentally, physically, to be the ones to deliver the new world. And that meant, carrying your homemade rucksack with basic provisions miles and miles over the hills and dales of England, and often doing it in a rather rough pair of woolen shorts, hand knitted knee socks and leather shoes, not in modern camping gear. And to carry all your stuff with you, so, your bedding, your tent, your provisions. Occasionally they did, there's photographs of trucks piled up with supplies and rucksacks. Sometimes that stuff did go ahead for them, but they weren't really well equipped. They were improvising. And that was part of the sort of the demonstration that you were Kibbo Kifty enough to lead the new world, because the new world that they wanted to found would need to be led by men and women of the highest caliber, people who could survive the sort of crash that he expected to come, that John Hargrave expected to come. So, you had to kind of go on these long walks. You had to become fit. You had to learn to survive without, luxurious food. It was quite a Spartan movement. I think sometimes people think it was a rather bohemian thing, that rather wealthy people were just kind of dressing up and mucking about in the countryside. But, there's quite a bit of hardship going on there. And, they were sleeping out, sleeping rough. Yes, glamping it was not, as you say.
I couldn't ignore either the incredible photographs of them at ancient sites. You mentioned, the hills and dales and valleys of Britain there, and there was this, quest, it seems, for the pathways of ancient Britain. There's those incredible photographs of the Kibbo Kift K symbols on Silbury Hill, at Stonehenge, with the shadow cast on, on the trilithons. There's all manner of ancient sites, and then chalk hill figures as well, with, like you say, the magical staffs and banners, and also banners of Silbury Hill and Old Sarum and all kinds of ancient sites. And I think there's a line which I can only paraphrase badly. You could probably remember the exact thing, but it was effectively looking into the past so that it could be reinterpreted in the present, to create and manifest a future that was one of modernity, but it certainly was connected with the ancient past. What are your thoughts on their, I suppose obsession is the right word, but certainly their quest to ancient sites? Because it was, we're talking about 1920 or so, and really exploring some of these places that, our relationship with them now is probably very different than it would have been then, pre-internet, pre-social change, pre all kinds of things that we know and take for granted. So to seek these places out and to find them and also to use them in such a beautiful aesthetic way, but also a very practical and magical way, it just, I kind of find it mind-blowing, their relationship with ancient sites. And I'd be really interested to hear more about what you think of that.
Yeah, it was such a key part of what they did. And for me, it was a really fascinating part of what they did, because, again, it was a sort of manifestation of the ancient and the futuristic. And they saw the landscape, the English landscape, the ancient English landscape, as this latent, sort of dormant, magical environment that, with the right set of conditions and the right set of rituals, could be brought to life. And they saw this kind of spiritual the spiritual life that's sort of bubbling in sometimes quite a literal way, sort of under the soil. And they saw this kind of magical potential there in the ancient environment. And they did study, as you said, they had to study ancient religion. They also had to study archaeology. And it was the time when people like Alfred Watkins are writing books about ley lines and so on. So there was a sort of pre-existing set of practices that they were fitting themselves into. They were expected to be knowledgeable about, how old these sites were and what they were for originally. But then there was another layer, which was the sort of magical and mystical, mythological side of those sites, which was seen to be also really essential to their meaning. And that's what they were kind of working with when they went on these trips, because they always styled them as pilgrimages. So it was a sort of spiritual journey to go to these high places, to go to these locations that they perceived to be the kind of spiritual centres and the places where the sort of connection to this deep and mystical history could be accessed. And to not only go to them to kind of look at them, but to go to them to venerate them, to consecrate them, and to kind of bring forth the sort of latent or dormant power that was within them. And they saw themselves as being the sort of natural inheritors of those ancient traditions, and they saw that they had the kind of mystical powers where they might be able to kind of draw forth energy from those sites. So that's why they go to them and they strip off naked, or that's why they go and they sort of bring a banner that is a kind of representation of that site. They kind of bring it to the location. So they bring a beautiful, very futuristic representation of the Long Man of Wilmington to the Long Man of Wilmington site. That both invests power in the object from that site, but also kind of, somehow refreshes it and brings forth its original power. So they were definitely doing that as a kind of spiritual practice. Yeah, the photographs are amazing. As soon as I saw those photographs, there's especially a sequence called the Wessex Pilgrimage by Angus MacBain, who went on to become an incredibly famous photographer of everyone, up to the Beatles. He photographed lots of sort of famous people from stage and screen, Vivian Leigh, Audrey Hepburn, Spike Milligan. But he's doing this in the 50s and the 60s, that kind of stuff. Back in the 20s, he was just working in a shop. He was a shop assistant in Liberty's department store. He'd yet to sort of discover the path that was stage photography. He'd also yet to discover the thing that was going to be his other kind of major identity discovery, which was that he was gay. So he was married. He had a wife who was also really interested in alternative education and alternative health. And through her, he got into Kibbo Kift. And he became the official photographer. But he'd never taken photographs like this before. He was just a young man kind of experimenting. But I think his sense of theatricality and his kind of close friendship with the people who he's photographed with as well really come through in those photographs. So he's kind of staging or restaging those performances of the K shadow on Stonehenge and the naked figure on Silbury Hill that I think are some of the most iconic images. And they're in this beautiful portfolio that he put together. They're very softly printed in beautiful enlargements. They're really quite beautiful products in their own right, but yeah, they do make manifest that particular very important, very central aspect of Kibbo Kift, which was that the ancient landscape was, contained what we might call earth mysteries. And in that way, they come before a lot of the stuff of the sort of 1970s, say, the kind of megalithomania, where there's a sort of a spiritual turn to thinking about kinds of, new myths and new age kind of myths of the landscape, and certainly before things like, Julian Cope's kind of rock and roll antiquarianism. So there were many reasons why I found Kibbo Kift really exciting when I first stumbled across them. They seemed like a sort of missing link in that story. It felt like a kind of earth mystery quest before the ones that we knew about. And as you said, that artistically, it felt like they were a missing link as well. They were a sort of English manifestation of, say, Central European Bauhaus practices, Central European avant-garde practices, and even Russian constructivism. There was sort of English manifestation of that and an English application of that, and just so extraordinarily unknown about. And when I did my book about them and the exhibition about them, so many people said to me, how can I have had an art education and not have known about this particular group of people? And in a way, it was because they were small and they were short-lived and they were obscure. But lots of art movements and lots of social movements are similarly small and short-lived. But some have been kind of consecrated and well-remembered and canonized, and others seem to be almost forgotten. So Kibbo Kift had that kind of, they had that sense of a sort of forgotten past, which, we might sort of learn from and revive certain parts of. So I found that really exciting when people have read the book and have sort of restaged the pilgrimages or they've remade the costumes. There are parts of the organisation that we probably might leave behind as well. There might be things we'd learn how not to do from Kibbo Kift, but some aspects of them seemed very timely, very now, as you say, because they're quite futuristic, and the future that they hoped would come has not yet arrived. This world peace future, this egalitarian future, and this future where we all go around in pointy hats and giant shoulders, because that hasn't yet been made manifest. They seem still very kind of live and full of potential and full of kind of modern presence, I think.
Yeah, I agree. I think, there are many seeds planted there, particularly in those early years, and so much of the energy that they put in. And, perhaps it's true that the same things they were looking for in the ancient landscape and trying to discover, they left something of themselves there, and they're there to be picked up still. And it does feel to me like perhaps their time is still yet to come. Whenever you've come along to speak at Stone Club events, people are always fascinated. There's still people finding out for the first time, still people, fascinated and wanting to read the book. It feels like it's something that's ever growing rather than something that's sort of had a moment in an exhibition. It feels to me like it's sort of becoming. I was interested then, listening to you talk about all of that in terms of your own relationship with ancient sites. As you were looking at those photographs and writing the book at that time and researching, did it make you go and visit those places, or did you already have a relationship with some of these ancient sites in Britain? I just wonder what your own relationship is with them, because you clearly understand them. This isn't a purely academic piece that you've written about them. It's coming from a place of understanding and knowing and having experienced, it seems to me. So has that been something that's long been an interest of yours in parallel to Kibbo Kift, to marry together through this process?
Yeah, I mean, there's a few sort of strands that really spoke to me. I mentioned about the sort of artistic one being this incredible side of neglect, and that corresponds to my academic day job. You know, I'm a art and design historian, so I felt I could read the costume, and I could read the artistic references in a way that perhaps someone looking at them as a social movement couldn't. But then the spiritual aspect, which I think is the other kind of main contribution that I tried to bring forward in the book, that kind of occult and pagan sort of set of references, I also felt that I could read those and take them seriously. In fact, that I thought some others could not. And that was because I have a background in that to some extent. So when I was 18, 19 or so, you know, perhaps even slightly earlier, I was part of the scene that's now called, in retrospect, New Age travellers, although we would never have called ourselves that at the time. That would have been deeply uncool. But, you know, I lived in a field with dreadlocks in my hair in Cornwall in a caravan. I lived in Rainbow Village in Liskeard, long gone. I lived in the ruined grounds of an old farm in Tavistock on the edge of Dartmoor in Devon, and I hung around with all the witches and the weirdos of, you know, the people who I thought were my tribe, you know, the people of Totnes. So if you know South Devon and you know the kind of people who hang out in that town, everyone there is some kind of spiritual seeker, some kind of neo-pagan, or bringing some kind of, you know, non-Christian spiritual belief to new and alternative ways of living. So I was doing that in the very late 80s, early 90s, and I was hanging around, you know, naked in stone circles on Dartmoor. I've got a set of photographs, actually, that I was part of a women's art group, and we pranced around on Scorrel Stone Circle without our clothes on, sort of draping ourselves over the stones. And some of the women's partners were photographers and took photographs of us doing that. And that was a sort of series of photographs that we exhibited. I look back at those photographs now and I think, hang on a minute, you know, there was me doing that kind of stuff with this group. We called ourselves Earth Spirit, all women, all artists in various forms, doing this stuff in the late 80s, early 90s, thinking that we were doing something really, really new in kind of reanimating ancient sites, bringing, you know, the sort of sacred sexuality of our bodies to these ancient sites. Of course, that was what Kibbo Kift were doing in the 1920s. So when I looked at Angus MacBain's photographs of people doing these kind of rituals in the English landscape, and when I read some of Hargrave's writing, he writes very beautifully about the kind of magical investments that sit in these ancient sites. I thought, again, here's another missing link. Here's something that people thought they were doing, you know, newly for the first time. And it was part of some kind of ancient tradition, and it was even part of a recent tradition. It was part of a tradition that was merely sort of 50 or 60 years old. So I found that really interesting. I sort of learned about the history of my own beliefs, and I was able to put them into kind of wider cultural context. And I suppose I was also able to think, there's a readership here, and there's a kind of a fan base almost of people who will find this really meaningful and interesting because they have those same kinds of belief systems. And I mean, I don't now prance naked round stone circles in the same way that I did when I was like 19, 20, but I think having had that in my life experience and sort of knowing those people from the kind of free festival movements and so on from those years really helped me kind of see this as part of a kind of countercultural tradition, I think. I
think all of that definitely fed in, you know, without knowing too much about your own personal history. It was clearly there and understood. And I think in some ways, perhaps that's why other people did struggle with elements of the story, in fact, previously, because, you know, it seemed to be missing, or at least wasn't explored as thoroughly. And yeah, isn't it interesting, but also such a useful thing that to be able to explore your own personal history through a group that existed all those years before without any knowledge of it at the time. And also the fact that these sites are still calling people, they're still calling people to use them in those ways. They're still calling people to explore in that same way. I'm sure, you know, there'll be a group there now, you know, probably doing a similar thing. And again, perhaps without the prior knowledge of the group that you were in, or the prior knowledge of of any of these groups we've discussed. It's one of the endlessly fascinating things for me about ancient sites is that, there's so much unknowable, but it doesn't make them less interesting. Actually just makes them far more fascinating, because getting to the bottom of it isn't the point. It's more the going there and experiencing it seems. So yeah.
I think the mystery element and the fact that there is this unknowability is part of the mystique and part of the attraction. It definitely was for Kibbo Kift. It was that this was this sort of unknowable world to which you can bring your imagination and you can kind of project your own investments. And obviously you can do that within the parameters of knowing some historical detail about, their origins and their functions. But because a lot of that is unknown, the past is this sort of, the ancient past is a site for projection. And I think prehistory was a playground for Kibbo Kift. It was a space where it could be whatever they wanted it to be, in the same way that the future was endlessly fascinating, because you could imagine, and project whatever you wanted into that future. So it enabled a kind of expansive and imaginative space where, it was there were fewer boundaries than kind of living in the present. So yeah, it was a place for escapism, but it was also a place where there was a sense of connection. And I think it gave people a sense of community, and I think it still does now. I think some people find security and comfort in the fact that they might be part of a really ancient tradition. And in Kibbo Kift terms as well, they were trying to get away from all the things that they thought were wrong with the modern world. They saw the modern world as overly complicated, bound up in fashion and manners and all of these kind of complicated rules and etiquette. And, to be fair, there were quite a lot of social demands and social etiquette that respectable people in the 1920s had to conform to. And they saw a kind of ancient figure, a kind of caveman figure, who was, very much a kind of figure that was of their imagination. But they saw that kind of person as concerned with things that were authentic, food, warmth and shelter, concerned with things that were kind of essentials. And they felt that if we could get back to essentials, if we could kind of shift the priorities of culture to get back to what was needed, and the skills, enhance the skills that were related to those kind of survival practices, and get back to something that was kind of at the heart of human experience, I suppose, that would be a way of kind of getting rid of all of the things that were kind of stale and inauthentic and overly elaborate in contemporary culture. So they saw it as kind of a space of possibility and as a site of community, but also as a kind of means of getting back to what was kind of human and meaningful.
I think there's plenty in there that's as pertinent and necessary for today as there was in 1920. Annebella, thank you so much for your time today, and also thank you for bringing even further life to the words and the images and the ideas in your book, The Kindred of the Kibbo Kift. It's an incredible piece of work. It's something that I can leaf through and just look at, and just find so much joy in, but also the ideas that you bring to life. Yeah, I just want to thank you for doing that, because I think it's a really incredible piece of work, and I recommend everyone goes and reads it.
Thank you very much. I'm very impressed you've read it twice. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to Stone Club Walks and Talks. You can find us in all the usual places, Instagram, Twitter, and of course our website, stoneclub.rocks. And don't forget to like and share the podcast. We'll be back soon with another walk and another talk. Goodbye.